Thanks so much for being here for the panel. It's my great pleasure to welcome you, and Jim is going to take over and introduce the panelists, and just please a round of applause for them. They've had to give up quite a bit to be here, so if you could just.
Thanks, Tukum. What Tukum didn't say is that he organized all of this, so thank you very much.
Yes.
Folks, good afternoon, and welcome to the panel, Low-Cost Manufacturing from Asian Tiger to African Lion. My name is James Thompson. I'm the founder and director of the Wharton Social Entrepreneurship Program. You'll notice from my accent, I'm not American. I'm Southern African. I've been here for about 15 years and have done a fair bit of work in this space, and I think that's why Tukum asked me to be the moderator. So you're not going to hear much from me, other than to say the debate is out. There are data coming in. Africa is on the rise. The question is how fast or how fast, and what is the nature of that rise looking forward from today. Many global manufacturers are considering the continent. We're looking at agribusiness development. We're looking at infrastructure development. And with everything that's going on, there are all sorts of issues, challenges, not unlike many other parts of the emerging world or the world that once emerged. So I'm thrilled today to have a somewhat unusual mix of panelists. And I'm going to give a very, very brief introduction to who they are, and then let them speak about themselves for 30 seconds. And then you'll hear from each of them for about 10 minutes. And I think you're going to get a somewhat useful, but also eclectic and unusual mix of perspectives. So we'll hear first from Stephen Golub. Steve is a professor at Swarthmore and is also one of our faculty at Wharton. Has been teaching there for the last 3 years, but he's been at Swarthmore for 30 years and has worked with some really interesting people, including with his co-author, James Tobin, the Nobel Prize winner in economics. And Steve is going to kick off the discussion today around this topic, and I think you'll find that, as he is prone to do, you will hear some statistics and hear about some data. Then we're going to hear from Kumi Otitwaju. Kumi is an entrepreneur from Nigeria, lives in Barcelona. We're going to hear about what it's like to operate in a business in Africa and her perspectives on this topic. More from her a little bit later. Then we'll hear from Herman Bigham. Herman is the CEO of a firm based in Kenya, textile firm, married to his spouse, who is...
Yes.
I had to think about that.
Happily.
Happily.
Though you're gorgeous.
And also a business partner. Herman will tell you a little bit more about that. And then we will hear from Tuba. I got to get this right. Gurjanlar, was that right? There we go. And Tuba works at the World Bank, is from Istanbul, and has done some really interesting work on Africa and light manufacturing. So we'll hear from Tuba at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to ask each panelist to give us just a 30-second kind of high-level picture of what they want you to know about them in this context, and then we'll kick off with Steve's 10-minute presentation. I would ask you that you hold questions until the end, if you don't mind. If there's a really burning question, please direct it at me, and I'll decide whether or not we deal with it at that time. And I'm going to hold the panel here till about 4:05, as requested by Tukum, because we started a little bit late, so don't feel pressured. And for all of you out there, we will have time for Q&A at the end. So if you wouldn't mind, Steve, just 30 seconds on who you are and what's relevant to here, and we'll go down the line, and then we'll kick off with your presentation.
Well, thanks, Jim. As Jim mentioned, I'm a professor at Swarthmore, and it's great to see some of my students here, African students. And I also teach a class at Wharton, and I'd be delighted to have some Wharton students who are from Africa in that class. It's about the world economy. I've been doing research on global manufacturing for about 20 years, and my work is on competitiveness, global competitiveness in manufacturing. And the bottom line is very simple. I look at wages and productivity together, unit labor costs. So how do countries stack up in that? So I've been doing that a long time. I come at it from that angle. I also have a lot of practical experience in Africa. I do a lot of consulting, a lot of research in Africa, and I've worked with the World Bank and other international organizations. I was the lead economist for something called the DTIS. It's a big study, interagency study of how countries can become competitive. And I had like 10 or so people working with me on customs, manufacturing, agriculture, and I've worked in Togo, Benin, Gambia, Cameroon, and South Africa. So I have a lot of experience on the ground in addition to my research work.
Right, thanks. Herman?
Good afternoon. I'm Herman Bigham. I'm a resident of Philadelphia. I'm an African born in America, married to a Kenyan, Lucy Lau Bigham, my spouse, who just took off for Kenya 2 days ago. Our commitment is demonstrated by the fact that she was in Kenya for 7.5 months this year, not with me. And we're a textile company, a green textile company. We produce high fashion bags, accessories, and textiles. In Kenya, we're employing over 200 African women through this project, and it's an independently developed project by my wife and myself. We're an LLC here in the U.S., and we're a social venture. And we hope our talk can inspire you.
Thanks, Herman.
Hi, this is Tuba Gurjannar from the World Bank based in DC. I worked in the World Bank for about 8 years, covered Africa for 6. I'm working with what was formerly called Finance and Private Sector Group. Now it's called Trade and Competitiveness. And I am somewhere between, I think, where Stephen is, which is a more academically oriented economist, and our business colleagues here at the panel. So my work is either focusing on lending programs to African governments, trying to promote their private sectors, and especially with the objective of improving trade and their competitiveness, and the kind of policy-oriented applied research that would underpin the design of such lending programs. And I think the perspective I'm going to bring is somewhere between practical and academic. And as James mentioned, that I worked for quite a few years on this program called Competitive Africa that produced 4 books, one of which was Light Manufacturing in Africa. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that too. Thanks.
Thank you, Tuba.
Hi, I'm Kumi Otitoju. I'm the founder and creative director of Minku Leather Goods. It's a Nigerian limited liability company. And pretty much the company is Forbes listed, and it's a little bit special because we use leather from Spain and combine it with ethnic materials, specifically ashoke fabric that is hand woven by the Yoruba people of Nigeria. We use that for the lining. So pretty much what you have is like a really contemporary product, but that has a lot of culture and a story, on the inside. And yeah, a lot of my contribution would be from that angle.
Super. Thank you, Kumi. Right, folks, without further ado, Steve, if you wouldn't mind just kicking off the discussion, I'll watch the time for you so you don't need to worry too much about it. And I'll give you a 2-minute heads up.
Thank you very much. Well, let me start by thanking Jim and Tukum. Tukum's the student organizer and has been very responsive to all my questions. And Jim has already sent me about 10 emails in the last 2 days, and he's being a very conscientious moderator. So thank you very much for inviting me and for your help. So our topic today is manufacturing. As I mentioned, it's an issue I've worked on for a long time, and I think it's of pivotal importance in economic development. And one can simply look at the East Asian experience in this regard. And next week, I'm going to South Africa for a conference on China's role in Africa, which is very topical. So I've been thinking a lot about China and China's role and looking at data on this. And it's pretty self-evident that manufacturing has played a massive role in China's development. Manufacturing exports to other countries. And this is true of East Asia generally and other emerging markets. In fact, there are very few countries that have been successful in development that have not succeeded in manufacturing exports. So manufacturing is pivotal. There is no question. But I would put the accent not just on manufacturing, but manufacturing exports, manufacturing competitiveness. Manufacturing by itself doesn't do that much for you. Africa's tried that. So did Latin America. Import substitution industrialization. That was the idea in the 60s and 70s. Africa tried to promote manufacturing industry behind very high tariff barriers for the domestic market. I think it's fair to say it was a catastrophe. It worked almost nowhere, especially in Africa. And I think there's still the legacy of that. Another area of my research is smuggling. It's a topic I've gotten into recently. And smuggling is very big. If you look at inter-African trade, it's reported trade, it's very small. But actually, it's a lot bigger because there's a lot of smuggling. I've been working currently on Central Africa, West Africa, and there is lots and lots of smuggling of manufactured goods into Nigeria. Why? Because Nigeria has very high tariff barriers, legacy of the import substitution era. But instead of promoting domestic manufacturing, what's happened is massive smuggling through Benin, Togo, and Cameroon. Cars, clothes, you name it. So it's a fascinating subject. So manufacturing is important, but you've got to be competitive. So why is manufacturing so important? Well, a number of reasons. Look again at China, other countries. Number one, most important, it creates jobs, labor-intensive manufacturing. Number two, being competitive in the world market forces you to be efficient. You pass the market test. Just like if you're a student, you've got to pass the test. You've got to be competitive, and that's the problem with import substitution. You don't have to be competitive. The third reason is you integrate the world economy and you have technology transfer, multinationals and so on. You've got to be part of the world economy. You can't try to reinvent the wheel here. The problem is Africa has not been very competitive. How do you see this? Well, I've been looking at trade between China and Africa, and overall trade between China and Africa is roughly balanced. But the structure of trade is woefully imbalanced. I've got charts here. If I had PowerPoints, I would show you. But you can see some charts here. They're very one-sided. Africa exports primary products. China exports manufactured. Overwhelmingly. And Africa exports a little bit of manufactured, but almost no labor-intensive manufactured. It's very surprising. You're not creating jobs in Africa. What's the problem? Why is Africa not competitive? Well, I mentioned before, it's the wage productivity balance. So wages are very, very low in Africa in the informal sector, but they're relatively high in the formal sector compared to productivity. The wage productivity balance is very unfavorable vis-a-vis East Asia. It's not very optimistic. On top of that, the business environment more generally is unfavorable. Don't have time to go into detail, but I think if you're from Africa, power outages, just take power outages. How can you run an efficient manufacturing business if you have no power? So I think many, many countries are struggling with this issue. So does that mean you can't be competitive in manufacturing in Africa? No. So I think some of my co-panelists are showing the way. I think in niche areas at the moment you can be competitive. In mass manufacturing, I'm not very optimistic that despite rising wages in China, there's an opportunity. Wages are rising in East Asia and China, but I think it's going to be very difficult for Africa to be competitive at the low-end manufacturing with Bangladesh, Cambodia, and so on. I'd be happy to be proved wrong, but I just don't see it. On the more positive side, I do think Africa can be competitive. There are other areas which can meet the three criteria talked about: labor intensity, technological upgrading, and meeting the market test. For example, in agriculture, even traditional primary products. People often think you've got to be in manufacturing, you can't be in primary products. That is very wrong based on my on-the-ground experience in Benin, Gambia. Cotton and peanuts are a high-tech good, okay? That's what I learned. Peanuts are a high-tech good. You've got to get it right, all right? Why? Just take peanuts. It's the same problem with manufacturing. You can't produce different size clothes and have it 2 weeks late and so on. With peanuts, you can actually make lots of money by selling edible peanuts instead of peanut oil. In other words, it's just the opposite of what many people think. You should manufacture peanut oil. Wrong. You should sell raw peanuts. Why? You can get a better price for a high quality peanut. But what's the problem? In Senegal and the Gambia, countries where I've worked a lot, they can't sell their peanuts because they're contaminated with aflatoxin. It's a cancer-causing substance. You cannot enter the market. Why not? What's the problem? Because you don't store it right. You've got to store it, and you've got to get it to market quickly. All the things they don't do, that don't happen in Africa, because the infrastructure doesn't work, because the government doesn't help business. So those are the core problems. You've got to have a business-government relationship like you had in East Asia. So see, the question isn't, can you be competitive in manufacturing? It's, can you get it right the way the East Asian countries did, and then you can maybe manufacture, but you can do a whole lot of other things. So I think the question should be posed a little bit differently. I'll stop with that.
Super. Thanks very, very much, Steve. We'll come back to you afterwards, no doubt, with some questions. And Kumi, if you'd like to kick off.
Sure. Yeah, so we're looking at just the manufacturing model for Africa, right? And Steve has talked a bit about what he sees, about like research-backed comparison between Asia and Africa, given Africa's current situation. And personally, I have 4 key arguments against low-cost manufacturing as a model for Africa, and I'll just go through those. The first is usually low-cost manufacturing means low wages and long hours for the workers, and that's just begging for worker dissatisfaction. I don't know if anyone has ever held a job that is like really poorly paid and where you have to work long hours and just not really have any creative control. And I live in Spain, and Spain is full of jobs like that. Like, it gets all the jobs that no one in the rest of Europe wants to do. And those jobs are really poorly paid, and all my peers complain about about the lives they live, but those are the jobs they get, and then you just find yourself in a situation of, oh well, at least I have a job, and do you want to live your 20s, your 30s, like the best years of your life like that? So if there's an alternate model, I think we should explore that before saying, oh look, Asia did this, and they're cool, so maybe we should do it too. The second is usually results in cheap products that you have to replace early, replace often, and I don't think Africa is in any place right now to really put in place like waste management beyond what we have now. If we create that problem of having huge machinery that generates all this, waste and all this pollution, we're setting ourselves up for something that right now may be good because we have all these jobs, but in a few years it's just something that needs to be addressed, and maybe addressed more urgently than Africa is ready for. And also, it's just, you create things at low cost, you're competing on price, you're competing on speed, you forget about beauty and quality, which are things that are very important to many people. For example, again, I live in Barcelona, and we get a huge amount of tourists every year. Yeah, they come for the beaches maybe, but many of them come to see architecture, Gaudi. Like, who has been? Yay. And that's nice, right? Because for example, when Gaudi, who's like the main modernista architect that people know from Barcelona, when he came, when he was creating all those things, he wasn't thinking, oh, in a few years, Barcelona is going to get a lot of its income from tourism. He was just doing stuff from soul and from, it was what he wanted to do. But then it had the side effect that is really good for one city, So I'll talk a bit later about a preferable model, I think, for Africa that actually makes use of our culture and what we have and what we are as a continent right now. The fourth point I have against low-cost productivity is that your job is only as secure as the time it takes to come up with a machine that does the same thing for even cheaper. So we're bringing in jobs, but we're not giving job certainty. So we're trying to solve a problem, but there's no guarantee that it's going to be a long-term solution. What do I think instead? What I do at Minku is make bags that people can, like most of my clients are from the US, or, you know, well, like about 65% of my clients are from the US. So it has a global appeal, I would say, well, from the US, from Europe, and then some from Nigeria. I'm doing a bit more marketing in Nigeria now, but there's a very global appeal for what I'm doing. But I'm using materials from Nigeria. So I'm using ashoke, which is just this beautiful fabric that is woven from cotton, hand woven, so it has all its imperfections, it has everything. And I'm using those to line the insides of bags. So you can have your black leather bag, but the inside it makes you happy. You're at work and you're stressed and you look inside and you're, okay, that's enough advertising for my brand, sorry. So what I'm trying to say is, I'm using something that maybe the people in Nigeria, for instance, when they're making it, they think, oh, this is a finished product. Someone's going to wear it on their head for a ceremony. But actually, those can still be raw materials for something else. And maybe there can be a bit more of a concerted effort into looking more into these indigenous, you can say crafts, but, you know, like creations that we have, and seeing how we can channel them into finished products, not just for Nigerian or South African or African companies, but luxury companies in Italy, in France. About 2 years ago, there was a conference. Well, this is an annual conference, but this year, in 2012, they were centered on Africa as a consumer and a producer of luxury. It's the International Herald Tribune Conference. I don't know if any. They have an annual luxury conference, and it's headed by Susie Menkes. She writes for the New York Times. Or she used to. I don't know if she retired. Well, she used to, at least. And she organized this conference every year. And that particular year, they were looking into Africa and considering the increased income of Africans, and how Diesel needs to be here, Prada needs to be here, Hermes, but they were also looking into how Africa could contribute to the luxury chain. So I think this is one way, that is an alternative to low-cost manufacturing, that actually uses what Africa is good at already and what Africa has, as opposed to just bringing in something entirely different and trying to make us adapt to that. That's not us, that's not what we have or are, and I'll stop there.
Super. Well, thank you. So far, everybody's doing pretty well on time. Right, so we're going to move over now to Herman.
And I might break that tradition. Kumi, thank you for your comments. And our work and our vision is in line with much of what Kumi had indicated. And it's a very realistic, on-the-ground manufacturer and also very positive, clear sense of opportunity and as a manufacturer and producer. We're a social enterprise. We're a green textile company, and our motto is honor the earth, okay? Textiles is one of the textile industry is one of the highest polluting industries and devastating industries to the environment, based on water consumption, chemicals used, dyes, pesticides, the effect on the soil, et cetera. It's one of the leading, most negatively impacting. And my wife has 25 years of experience in working with communities to adapt traditional skills into globally competitive products. She also has a master's in international business, and she is the textile person in the business. I want to really give you some, I want to go back to the title of the conference dealing with African development models. One of the primary issues I've had in coming to this and other conferences dealing with African development is that there's little time or no time. In fact, a young lady in the audience said this to me earlier, really discussing from an African point of view what that model should be. Is, you start off a conversation, you start talking about China or Indonesia or Pakistan. No. We need, as Africans, as Africans, we need to make a decision and have clarity about our own capacity. And a few years ago, as a participant in this conference, I did an exhibition of traditional African art. It's something I do professionally. I've had 3 million people see our exhibitions of my organization. We do educational exhibitions for the purpose of maintaining traditional African cultural ideas and mores. An example of why they're important, well, in a previous presentation today, dealing with banking, a gentleman from Ghana made a very clear comment that the audience found very hilarious. He said, community banks are the way to go. He said, versus commercial. Now, he runs a commercial bank, but he was saying in terms of smaller loans, not just because of the issue of management of smaller loans, but he was saying in terms of payback, he was saying that basically in Ghana, loans that are generated by community-based organizations have like a 95% payback, okay? And the others have about the reverse default rate, okay? Now, you ask yourself why. You can look at, economic issues, but it's really not about economics. It's about culture. And that's the thing we've neglected to look at. Culture is what makes people pay back their loans in the community because, as he said, you can't go to church next Sunday if your loan not paid back. You can't go to the market. See, we have to understand who we are, okay? All right? And operate out of that and as a strength because it's a global strength. We're the first people on the continent. We are the people who brought civilization, millennia and held that position of dominance in the world for millennia. We need to know that. We need to operate out of that position. History, is not something that this happens over, has to be looked at over a period of time, okay? And what we've gotten trapped into is looking at the colonial and post-colonial and period of enslavement. We need to be looking at the history of Shanghai, Mali, major trade centers in the world where Europeans came to be educated, okay? Same thing with all the way back to ancient Kemet. So now that's us, and that's what we need to know and operate out of. I see too many of us with, carrying multiple degrees but operate as small boys and small girls in economic and business environments because we don't know who we are. I'm going to tell you who we are. We are bad people, all right? And and other people know it. That's why often we are oppressed. You can't think about this. If you're an inferior people, you don't require to be held back. You can be given all the quote advantages and you won't succeed. But obviously that's not the paradigm that we operate under. So we need to act and operate and plan as an African people based on African models of success. The exhibition that I did talked about group identity, cultural continuity is a key to defining purpose, destiny, and the activities of our daily lives. We must analyze our history, cultural systems, and extract and internalize the best practices from them and build a more human, meaningful, and fulfilling future. Now, that's not Bangladesh, okay? As she was just describing, that's not Cambodia, that's not Vietnam, that's not China. And you talk about competition. We're a small business that's, that's operating, that's had an incredible impact, and yet unfunded. But at the same time, we have had we've had a major carpet manufacturer who wanted to joint venture with us in Kenya. We had a major bag manufacturer who was employing like 30,000 people in China who wanted to do business with us. Okay, so this whole notion about you can't be competitive globally is I consider an error. Also, you have to look at what you have to define what your competition is and what you want to produce. Let me give you an example of our business model. Okay, cotton. There's discussions about how cotton should be developed, how cotton should be used. Okay, let's go to Kenya. Kenya, for 25 years ago, Kenya had employed over 200,000 people in their textile industry. Okay, and we can go into later into why that, how that changed, because that was the same thing in Ethiopia, Nigeria, Ghana, all these countries. In fact, Ethiopia was and Egypt were totally textile sufficient. They were exporting to other countries. All right. Now, how did that get turned around? We need to look at that. All right. So it's not like it hasn't happened before. We haven't done it. Okay. We need to look how to sustain it in this current environment. All right. For example, for us, we do everything from grow organic cotton to make carpet to clothing. All right. We have 3 different lines. We have a line called Creating Recycled Treasures. We actually set up a collections program with the Walmart of Kenya to collect plastic waste. Anyone who's ever been outside of this country can tell, that plastic waste is a huge problem globally. Well, even in this country, only 3% of the plastic bags that are collected in this country, 3% of the plastic bags that are dispensed are collected and recycled. But we live in an environment where we're more sophisticated at hiding our waste, okay? But in Africa and the rest of the world, we don't hide it well. So what we're looking at doing and what we've done is actually create an industry around the collection and commodification of plastic bottles. People who do bottles, we're doing it with plastic bags. We're working with Nakamat and Ichumi in Kenya. We also, cotton production. We've set up in Kenya, we introduced the growing of organic cotton in Kenya using traditional means and locally available plant life. Okay, we're using something called neem. People in the audience, raise your hand who are familiar with neem, N-E-E-M. Okay, well, guess what? Neem, neem in India is a multi-billion-dollar industry. In Senegal has, in the world, I think Senegal has the 3rd most quantity of available neem, followed by Kenya. And in those countries, among others, in Africa, it's not used for its purpose, for its primary purpose. Okay, for its primary purposes. Neem. There was a study done by a conglomeration of institutions globally to look at how the most important tree and shrubs and plant life for human development and human benefit for the future. Out of all the plant life that was reviewed, neem was considered to be the most important.
30 seconds.
So I'm just saying to you, the idea, and the reason I mention neem is because it's there, but it wasn't being used, and it kills over 200 insects, et cetera, et cetera. Silk. We also developed silk in the country. We have the only license for producing Erie silk in the country. Look on the web, you'll see major articles in all the major newspapers and on television about silk development in Kenya. Let's do this.
Thank you. Right. Thank you, Herman. Tuba?
Sure, thank you. So before I start, can I take a little poll? How many in the room is interested in exploring at some point the prospect of investing or investing in the entrepreneur or becoming an entrepreneur in processing or a manufacturing industry in sub-Saharan Africa? Okay, I'm glad I asked. So I'll just raise few highlights from some of the research we did. I'll echo some of the things that Stephen already talked about, but I'll try to kind of wrap up. And I actually, some of our findings echoes Herman and Kunmi's experience too. So I think we're kind of converging on the same page. But I'll wrap this up with a few what I think are somewhat provocative questions, and then maybe that's a good segue to the discussion itself. So the book I mentioned in the beginning is called Light Manufacturing in Africa, and it came from this series we worked on over 3 years or so in the World Bank, looking at industries' performance in sub-Saharan Africa, how they compare to the rest of the world, and where they need to be for the kind of growth objectives we have for sub-Saharan Africa. And Light Manufacturing was the first book we worked on, and the reason it becomes so attractive from a development economist's point of view is the past experience that Stephen talked about jobs and industrial basis that it provides. And there's ample research showing that for structural transformation, manufacturing played an incredibly important role. Actually, last year, Asian Development Bank released this piece of research that showed there's 42% likelihood of moving on to high-income status if you have at least 18% of your workforce at the peak of your industrialization in manufacturing industries, which is most of the good performance in Asia achieved. Looking again at Asia's performance, you find really incredible numbers such as 700 million people moving into industrial jobs, urban population increasing at rate of 60%, increasing from 442 million to 1.6 billion people, China alone adding 120 million jobs. So if we take some proxy of these, and if we were to think of similar scenarios in sub-Saharan Africa, we'll be all set. This is kind of what we want for the place. And that's why we all become so interested in the issue of competitiveness across industries, and also the issue of light manufacturing, whether it's a real prospect for sub-Saharan Africa. So what the book found is something's quite predictable. What we saw is that for light manufacturing, as Stephen suggests, there's an incredibly fierce competition out there. What seems to be the most binding constraint is the weakness of the investment climates across sub-Saharan Africa, because the break or make point becomes the transaction cost for businesses, which are especially important for light manufacturing industries, where you have shrinking margins over time. The other issue, well, the more specific issues then within that space is the cost of trade logistics, input access and input costs for light manufacturing sectors, and access to serviced industrial land. While we were doing this work, we actually worked closely with governments of China and Vietnam. We tried to study their experience and also see actually what they had to say about the prospects of manufacturing in sub-Saharan Africa. So the stories from China and Vietnam, some are known, but we focused on 4 or 5 industries. And so just to give you some kind of more specific findings. So we found there are some industry-specific issues across a number of light manufacturing products we looked at. So for example, if you're going to promote your leather industry in Ethiopia, there is a significant issue with cattle disease. So that needs to be taken care of at a more national level. If you're going to promote green beans in Kenya, where there's some potential, you're going to have to work around the agricultural policy issues. In agribusiness across sub-Saharan Africa in general, actually, policy distortions play an important role. If you're going to work on metal industries, and again, in Ethiopia, you need to make sure that you have access to industrial land. That's one of the biggest issues for steel related industries. But more across the board, again, coming back to the issues around investment climate, trade logistics was something that made cost of doing business really high for African companies, and also the lack of entrepreneurial skills, which I'll come back to, and we'll have, I think, Herman and Kunmi maybe say a little more about this. In terms of lessons coming out of China and Vietnam, we saw that there were these experimentations with plug-and-play industrial zones across China, which played an important role for their manufacturing industries. We saw that they especially promoted key input industries with either regulatory relief or with some sort of finance or promoting FDI. They tried to make trade logistics easy. So the lesson from China and Vietnam on that angle is not easily replicable because it requires an incredible infrastructure investment. And again, they worked on things like entrepreneurial skills with these programs, one that we studied from Japan called the Kaizen model. All this being good, so now I'll move on to the couple provocative statements. So we said in this book that there's hope for light manufacturing, but it's going to take very diligent, very targeted policies, and it's going to take real integrity and honesty from policymakers' point of view, because you're going to have to carry out these programs in very transparent manner, and you're going to have to be open to experimentation and change route if your policies don't play out the same way that they played out in China and Vietnam, which is quite likely. So in the case of China, for example, all these policies partly worked because Chinese government was extremely open to helping creative destruction, so to say. So it wasn't necessarily about picking winners, but it was more about seeing how they can open the route so that the water can run the way it should be running, rather than trying to kind of construct a system that they didn't actually know how it would pan out eventually. So the question now, I think some of the panelists also raises whether light manufacturing is the correct route for sub-Saharan Africa, even though there's some pockets of potential and there are things that we can do to promote light manufacturing in some subsectors. It's becoming harder. Not only in sub-Saharan Africa, across the world. When we look at the manufacturing trends, we actually see that there's been job losses across the board, across all countries, including the US. I think some of the most interesting research on this is coming from the US, because until quite recently, there's been this broad-based perception that the US competitiveness in manufacturing was on decline. And more recently, the consensus is that it's not declining per se, but the most job losses actually were to productivity gains rather than manufacturing competitiveness being weaker. So that's going to be an issue for sub-Saharan African manufacturing too. The issue of convergence, so low wages and factor costs being an advantage for sub-Saharan Africa, is going to be less relevant going forward. So what all this means is that we need to redefine what structural transformation may look like for sub-Saharan Africa. We need to think about sectors, as Stephen mentioned, agribusiness. That was our second book, and during the discussion I can come back to this. There's some incredible potential in that sector, and when we think about it as processing, I think we can also kind of lump it within that manufacturing mindset we have. And most importantly, I think Herman and Kunmi are the kind of the live examples of this. It's going to take creativity and entrepreneurialism to kind of build the new future of what all of this competitiveness may look like. And I think it's going to be people like you who will create new niches. The involvement of ICT and services in manufacturing is just being studied recently. There's some studies showing that there's strong correlation between how advanced these sectors are for the prospects of manufacturing. So the manufacturing landscape is going to look different, and I think most of us don't know yet what it's going to turn into. But I think it's the entrepreneurs like you who's going to redefine it for Sub-Saharan Africa especially, but across the world.
I think the first misconception that I come across quite frequently is this: Africa is not one country. And it's amazing to me how many people around the world think Africa is one place. Like it must all be the same because it's called Africa. And, the example I often use is, well, when last were you in Indonesia and then the next day, you were in Mongolia? You tell me those are the two same places, right? Well, they're completely different. And by the way, the north of Africa is further from the south of Africa than those two countries. And to me, African nations and regions need to decide what they want to become. There are pockets of success everywhere, if you look. So these comparisons can be useful, but they can also be less than useful on occasion. Steve actually prompted a thought a number of years ago when I was doing my PhD research. I came across the work of a guy called William Baumol, and predecessors in economics like the likes of Bauer. And Baumol wrote a very interesting piece in 1990, and he talked about the different kinds of entrepreneurship. And by the way, Steve, it was your smuggling comment that came up, because Africa's economy is bigger than people think it is. All you got to do is go there and have a good look. Mm-hmm. It's way bigger than people think it is. Yeah. And some people are starting to do some really neat research on that right now. So business is being done, it's just being done a little bit differently than in other parts of the world. Not unlike some parts of Asia, but the informal sector is definitely unique in many respects. And Baumol's perspective is this: entrepreneurs are everywhere. All you got to do is write the rules of the game, and they will do what they are genetically inclined to do. So the rules are everything. And this is not just Africa. This is anywhere where you're thinking about development. And he speaks of three different kinds of entrepreneurship. There's productive entrepreneurship. This is what builds economies. There's unproductive entrepreneurship. And I suspect we're seeing some of this. I hate to admit it, but in South Africa recently, if any of you read the media this last week about the massive growth in government expenditure as a percentage of GDP, government expenditure as in government wages and expenses, not government expenditure elsewhere in the economy. This to me is terrifying. In 2002, I wrote a very favorable article on the fiscal discipline being exercised in South Africa. To me, they were the model. And they've seemed to have lost their way recently, so I'm hoping they start to come back a little bit. And then there's, of course, destructive entrepreneurship, and this is, organized crime and other things. The point is this: the rules dictate who succeeds and who does not. So I think the onus is on Africans and African countries to decide what kind of economic development they want and to put the rules in place. And this goes to some of the stuff you folks were speaking of, which is, government, transparency, policy, all that stuff. And the reason I mention this is because we did some research in the writing of a book recently, and most of the research for the book was done in Zambia, in South Africa, Botswana, Malawi, Mozambique. And, we had the usual questions out there. What gets in the way of success? That's what I was really interested in. And everyone talks about success. Very few people talk about failure. So I want to know why things weren't working by good-intentioned people. And interestingly enough, we had, undeveloped markets, infrastructure, technology, all that stuff. But the three things that came out as the number one reasons for challenges in scaling businesses were: one, obstruction by people objecting to change. Now, wherever you go in the world, there are people who are doing quite well with things just like they are. And if you threaten that status quo, they will push back. You can predict that with nearly 100% confidence. The only things that change is the speed of that response and the nature of that response. But if you push hard enough, you will get pushed. And I think this is where we get back to policy, the rules, enforcement, etc. Two, unpredictable governance. That does not mean no governance. It means unpredictable governance. Business requires low volatility in decision-making parameters. So governance is really important if you want to get long-term investment for, heavy balance sheet type industry. If you don't, that's okay. You just won't get it. And then the third thing, indifference by parties whose support is necessary for success. And indifference is an interesting term because it doesn't mean that they don't care. It can mean they just don't care enough to try and help somebody else succeed. And by the way, this wasn't just Africa. This was across the world. Across the world, on every continent. So, I wanted to raise that because the rules of the game are really important, and these are not unique to Africa, these problems. So I think they can be worked around if, Tuba, to your point, there is the diligence, the targeted policy making, and then the fortitude to push this stuff through. And then I wanted to raise a couple of things just as things to provoke some thought. And I don't know the answers to this, but I suspect we'll discover them in the next decade or two. One is agribusiness. Everywhere I go in Africa where there's decent soils, people have a very close affinity to agribusiness in many, many shapes or forms. What is the nature of that ecosystem, those value chains in the next 3 to 5 decades for Africa? How can Africa use that, be capitalized on? We know the global food consumption demands and consumption are growing. Africa has greenfield real estate. The question is, how was it developed? What are the impacts of that? What does that fuel in turn? And then next is energy. There's really some really interesting energy finds on the continent in recent times, and recently right off Mozambique. That is a big deal. Depending on who you speak with and the nature of the utility that's created, the cost of energy on site is about a quarter of what it is once it's shipped around the world to another production environment. Now that number is sometimes half of that. The point is this: in lower labor heavy industry with heavy energy demands, that is a big, big deal. And I think Africa is going to see opportunities to make plays in places that people typically did not expect Africa to make. And we've seen examples of this already in some places. So that's enough from me. Thanks to the panel. What I'm going to do is we have a question there already. If you wouldn't mind, please stand up, state your name and your affiliation, and one question only, please. If you pose a second or a third, I will ask you to sit down politely.
Hello, I'm Longue and I'm fellow at Stanford. So, anticipated the number of questions I will have asked. I will have asked 5 questions. Now, I'll combine them into one. What is and what should be the contribution of Africa, especially the manufacturing sector, to the global value chain? And this is a question which was overlooked, I think, during the presentation. And globally, am I explaining too much or is it fine?
Make it quick.
Yeah. So, and what policies should be adopted from decision makers in order to facilitate increase the level of industrialization while better contributing to global value chain?
Thank you very much. Who would like to take a shot at that? Steve, do you have a perspective on that relative to global output?
Sure, I think we actually were addressing that. I think you addressed it. Tuba did. I think you have we have 2 entrepreneurs here who show you that in certain niche markets that Africans can make a contribution and are doing that. Beyond that, I think the point Tuba made and also Jim made, that there's tons of entrepreneurial talent in Africa. There's just, I mean, that's evident wherever you go. But the rules aren't very good often. They're getting better. I think, you know, the Africa Rising, but it's a little overhyped, I think. There's so much more to do. The rules have to get better so that you channel entrepreneurialism in a more positive way. And the state doesn't sort of predate off business, but really works with business. So I would just reemphasize some of those points we already made.
And just to give numbers, so you said what should be, I think what Stephen mentioned. In terms of export contribution, Sub-Saharan Africa actually accounts for less than 2% of world's exports, and this hasn't changed since 1980. This is not to say that Sub-Saharan Africa is not exporting more in absolute terms, and it's from its own base level, it's been growing. It's just it hasn't kept up with the other regions of the world in terms of the performance growth. So there's a lot to be done in terms of catching up with the fast industrializers, catching up with the fast growers of the world. The other data point is Sub-Saharan Africa receives 5% of world's FDI, and most of this goes into extractive sectors that actually don't have strong linkages to local industries, which is the kind of the core element of being part of these global value chains. And this is also where you would likely find most benefits from global value chains. Global value chains is an area that actually World Bank is trying to focus on more and more. The discussion is out there. To the extent that local industry linkages can be built and that it can actually facilitate kind of a basis improvement in terms of business capabilities and the building of these business capabilities, it's desirable, having being part of global value chains. There is a risk that you isolate by allowing certain, through export zones, certain fragments of the production being completely focused in a certain country can actually make it difficult for them to climb up the value chain. So as long as you mitigate against that risk, you want to be part of that. And you also want to be part of that because top 1% of exporters in the world command 50% of the world exports. So you want those big guys operating in Sub-Saharan Africa, which all comes back to what Stephen and James were saying, and I think Kunmi and Herman, I'm sure, appreciate all the time, is whether you have the rules of the game set properly.
Just to clarify, does that less than 2% include natural resources or not?
It does include natural resources.
Yeah.
Folks, thanks. We're going to take one from the lady up front here, if you don't mind. We'll go to the gentleman with a grey sweater on, and then we'll go back to the lady over there. How's that? Please, name, affiliation, single question. Thanks.
My name is Esina Mashesi University, Ghana. Sorry, I have two questions. I'll make it quick. First, to Kumi and Cameron, talking about public policy and culture and how you manage both to make sure that your enterprise really runs effectively. If you can give examples of what policies in the home countries you're working in has helped you to facilitate the process for your business, and what are the opportunities for growth? And with Steve...
One question only, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, I'll tell you what we're going to do. I'll take a few questions, and then we'll deal with them. So we'll come back to you now. If I could take your question, please.
Hello. Uzo Uche, University of Pittsburgh. So with regards to your comment on the racketeering or underground trade, I think the rules have been set in Africa. But outsiders looking in just don't see how it fits their rules of trading. So the big problem I see is there is a big margin being made for people who are profiting from this. How do you open it up to the common man to actually gain from it? If you agree with the rules actually being set by the African standards, depending on what part of Africa.
Super, thank you very much. The lady over there, and then the gentleman in the blue shirt.
RPA candidate. My question is posed to Stephen. You talked about Africa's ability to be competitive relative to the Eastern Asian model, and in particular Cambodia and Bangladesh. The Eastern Asian model in the last couple of years has seen a lot of strikes combined with disruption, as well as low wages and those with no benefits. I'm a big advocate for manufacturing in Africa. I think the workforce is there and the ability to train them. But my question is there sustainability in replicating the Eastern Asian model that has seen a lot of instability in the past couple of years?
Great, thanks. One more, and then we'll take a shot at answering those. And if we have some time, we'll go to the gentleman in the back in the black suit. Here first, and then we'll deal with those, and if we have time, come back to you, if that's okay. Thanks.
So my question is to Steve and Tuba as well, about the policy as well. We all agree that ISI didn't work, but we want to, I think a lot of African countries are trying to implement kind of this East Asian model, and I'm not arguing, I think it has worked, but how, if you don't want ISI, if you want the East Asian model, how do you meet the middle? Meaning ISI, the government was too involved, the East Asian model, the government is involved. What is the role of government? How can they be involved but not hurt the industries?
Right. Did Herman, did you and Kumi get the first question? Do you want to take a shot at that?
Kumi, you want to start out? Whatever. Okay. Okay. It's been a minute since the question was asked. All right. Just rephrase the question real quick. Real quick.
How policy has helped?
Okay. Got it. All right. Okay. In our business, we're in the agribusiness. Okay. And so we work with the Cotton Authority. We work with the EPA of Kenya, et cetera, et cetera. And what's happened is we've had to take the lead to push them to be able to do the things that they are not accustomed to doing. Earlier James made a comment, and I smiled because he was saying people are in a box. People have to get out the box. People, there's a lot of colonial mentality where people are trained and to do things a certain way, and even if they don't work, they'll tell you, well, this is the way we've always done it. It happened to us recently. And so the point is, we have to move the box because people, as he's talking about the inertia, there's inertia because of what I mentioned. There's inertia because people have a vested interest, just of seeing things done a certain way or whatever, or an economic interest. But really, as businesses, you have to make business and industry has to make the government accountable, responsible, and productive in terms of the environment they create for us to operate, and that's what we've done. And as a small business, so we've moved. We moved the Cotton Authority. It took 3 years for us to get a call back. Now we're on speed dial. They don't do nothing. When they get ready to do an event, they call us. They say, are you available to do X? Are you available to do Y? Because we're their show and tell, okay? But that came from persistence. That came from product. That came from uniqueness. In fact, the products that are going around the room are products of ours that we manufacture. They're made from recycled materials. I would hazard most of you would not guess what the materials are. We're getting a patent because we've created some new actual fibers and textiles. And and just to say to you, there's, you have to move the ball forward and you have to be persistent. But now, again, in fact, I was at an event here at Wharton where the ambassador of Kenya spoke about our project in Kenya. And I had to go up and say to him, hi, I'm Herman. It's our project you're talking about. So that you can move the ball forward. You really can. But you have to be diligent. You have to be, really committed.
Thank you. Kumi, comment? You good? Okay, super. So questions 2, this was directed to you, Steve. Smuggling, racketeering, the current rules. How does one open that up to the common man?
Right. And then the following question, I think, was also directed at me, was Oh, microphone. Yeah. Also a question about the role of government more generally. And was there anything else also?
I had a question about replicating the agency.
Right. So I think all those are related. Let me try to address them. My reading about East Asia and the model and replicating it is the thing I admire about the East Asian governments generally is the pragmatism. So in terms of your question, they tried to figure out what will work and did rather different things. And they didn't always get it right by any means, but they set basic rules for entrepreneurs. The Korean government, for example, the Taiwanese government, they were just absolutely remarkable, quite interventionist, actually. But President Park of Korea, and I don't recommend this be replicated, but he went and he said to the business community, you're going to jail, okay, if you don't do a better job, all right, if you're corrupt and so on. And he did it. So the thing is, you need a commitment by the government. And the problem with African governments, and I don't totally know the reason for this, is that special interest groups play very strong roles, and they distort it. And again, the case of smuggling and the illegal economy, the creativity of the smuggling industry is just staggering. I mean, it's just amazing. The car industry in Benin, it's just, Benin, this little country next to Nigeria, imports hundreds of thousands of cars, which they then figure out how to get to Nigeria. Amazing entrepreneurship. Yes. Okay? Yes. All right? But it's all to evade Nigerian barriers, you see? So it's very problematic. So what about the East Asian model? I agree that the low wages are problematic, but see, here's the thing about Africa also. This dichotomy between the formal and the informal sectors. People in Africa are very, very, very poor, all right? So you can criticize East Asian wages, but it's a big step up. And you see, in Asia, it's a big step up from gathering trash in a garbage dump, which is what many of the people do, to work in a factory. It's not great. So you have to work your way up, all right? You're not going to get from a very low level to a high level, but you need a government that promotes it and works with it and works with international organizations and promotes the domestic entrepreneurs. So I think it's a variety of things, but above all, what you need is what some people call a developmental state. That's a government that really is committed to development. And I see signs of that. For example, I know Tuba's written about the Ethiopian government, and the Ethiopian government's getting some things right and some things not so right. I think they're trying to follow the Korean model. Okay? So it's about getting policy right. I think the entrepreneurship is there in Africa. The workers are there. Nobody works harder than Africans. But you have an environment that's very inimical to attracting foreign investment, to fostering your own entrepreneurs. So I think you got to deal with that whole nexus of problems.
Thank you very much, Steve. We have, folks, we have time, Tukum tells me, for one more question. So the gentleman in the back with a black suit. One question, please let us know who you'd like to answer, then I'll wrap up with a couple of words and we'll be done.
Okay. I think this is probably a question for you and maybe the professor. I think in this entire conversation, I didn't hear you guys hop on, power. I think if you're from Africa, you've experienced power. So how do we expect to move in that industry and, do all this manufacturing things when we do not have power? Where I come from, the power station that's there was built by a former colonizer. We haven't done anything in 30 years. So I don't get how we're merging that.
Okay. Tuba, Steve, do you guys want to comment? I have an anecdotal response, which is something I don't like to do wherever possible, but I'm happy to share it if you want to hear it. So, Tuba, Steve?
It's electric power. That's... Yeah. I just, if I had my slides, I would show you. I think that's the number one issue. It's a litmus test of whether a government's doing its job. You have electric power, all right? Because it's a public good that could be provided by the private. It's a public good, and without electric power. So, I've got some numbers here. In South Korea, guess how much electric power losses? How many power outages there are per year? 0. All right? Okay. End of story.
You know, I find it interesting to hear. I mean, we operate in Kenya, all right? We're about to live in Kenya, and I'll be building my 100th plus home in Kenya. I'm a real estate developer by background. Anyway, I find it interesting to talk about that which is problematic, does not exist. In relation to power, in relation to that which should be commonly available to the public good, look at the city of Detroit. Right now, you have, in the city of Detroit, you have 15% of the population who's having their water cut off by the city. Now, this is America. So what are we talking about? Hello? Okay, so that's where values come in. Meaning, if we're in a country that supposedly has wealth, and certainly has resources, what is the distribution of wealth? That's why we're not trying to follow an Asian model. Also, how can you justify what's happening with the schools throughout this nation and throughout the communities throughout this nation? I live within blocks of this facility, and I can tell you universities like Drexel have had no positive impact in terms of employment or of those other issues. Okay, so we have to look at things, and be clear how things really operate.
Okay, is that it? Are you sure? It's your forum. All right, we got the very last question. Okay.
I had noticed that earlier on at the very beginning, my name is Bumi Akinsami, Carnegie University. I noticed that Bumi had said that there was an alternative that she had to low-cost manufacturing, but we never got to circle back to that. And I was wondering if you could just take a few minutes to tell us about it.
Oh yeah, I did talk about that a bit. There's a lot that can, look, I was born in Nigeria. I'm used to having 3 hours of electricity a day, okay? You learn to live around it. Electricity is a luxury. You all live here.
Thank you.
You don't know what happens when electricity comes back in Nigeria. You charge all your phones, you iron your clothes, like we're all here talking about we need electricity 24 hours a day. There's a lot that can be done without electricity. I'm sorry, until the government gets around to fixing that, we all deal with it. And there's a lot of manufacturing that can be done in Nigeria without electricity, and it's happening, and there is an industry there. All these wooden looms, they're a bit slow, but Nigeria, for example, has 150 million people. Imagine if you motivate 1% of that to just get to, making their lovely fabric. They're going to be able to sell it at a much higher price than the polyester that comes from China. Things like that, So we need to look at what's on ground and just kind of work with that, like, I'm sorry you don't have electricity, but make your beads with the wooden thing, and there's a market for that. We're not talking about making stuff that just ends up in an art market. We're talking about maybe we should be working to create a market for that, as opposed to saying governments should change all those things before we can duplicate what another country does that is already moving on to the next thing.
Thanks. Just a final comment with power. I echo Steve's sentiment. I think if the right rules are in place and enforced, you can get support to build power plants. The question is what kind of power plants, and unfortunately it takes long to do it. But to me, that's no different from raising, capital for a business. There's a risk, there's a time profile. Is somebody going to get the money back? And I think this, to me, it is the litmus test of a government's long-term intentions and where its priorities lie. So it's a tough short-term problem, but there are places on the continent that are dealing with it. South Africa is not one of those places yet. They're trying really hard, and some recent announcements hopefully will help. So folks, we're out of time. All of you have done very well and sat here all the time. So I'd like to thank you all and thank the panelists. And if you wouldn't mind a quick round of applause, and then I'm going to ask you for something. So thank you, Steve, Herman, Tuba, Kumi. I know this is a Saturday for you, and we really, really appreciate it. Tukum, you're a star. Thank you very, very much for organizing this. Guys, we have a sincere favor to ask. Each of you have one of these. It's just a very short score card. Please fill it out. These guys would like to use it for next year's conference. And then lastly, I had 3 people ask me for copies of my book on social entrepreneurship. I have only 5 or 6. You may have them if you're doing something in social enterprise. Thank you very much, everybody. Okay.